Welcome to lesson number 2. Today we're going to be dealing with a little bit of revision, and then we're going to be doing pteridophytes, and then in the next lesson I'll be doing angiosperms and gymnosperms and all the other bits and pieces around that. This lesson might be a bit short, but it'll be a good place to stop, and then we can carry on again. Alright, so what I wanted to do today was just remind you about the idea of what haploid and diploid is. Please remember that haploid means you only have one set of chromosomes, so that's like 1/2 of what your full set is, and diploid means you have 2 full sets of chromosomes. All right, pteridophytes are absolutely beautiful. They are great, and please remember that these are less evolved, as the same with the mosses. Like, you know, what you're going to be noticing is like how the characteristics build up as we get all the way to angiosperms, which are the most evolved plants that we have on Earth at the moment. And to a large extent, it's interesting because the Earth used to be overrun by pteridophytes. Ferns were the only plants that were actually growing, and this was because of the idea of the vascular tissue. So I just want to remind you what vascular tissues are again, and that is xylem and phloem. Remember that xylem transport water and dissolved substances, whereas phloem transports glucose and amino acids. All right. So again, it says here, ferns grow in shady, damp habitats and have spores. So again, you're noticing that they grow in these shady, damp areas because they are so reliant on water, and they don't have a very thick layer of wax over their leaves to actually stop water from escaping out of the leaves themselves. So they're trying to, grow in these dense little groups where they're actually able to share the water and actually kind of lay over each other so that they don't lose all of their water. Again, they have spores, so much like mosses, they have spores, which are also haploid, whereas you'll find that seeds are diploid and they grow in a very different way when we get to that later. Funny enough, now all of a sudden we realize we have true roots, true stems, and true leaves. So you can almost imagine that the plant has gone for full-blown differentiation. It's actually able to develop organs now, and these organs are allowing it to grow better. Please also note that a fern is, mosses grow anywhere, no taller than 4 millimeters high, whereas some ferns can grow, gosh, almost 1/2 meter high. So you're noticing now it's also because of the vascular tissues that they're able to grow upwards. And there are a couple of advantages of being able to grow upwards as well, and that is having access to more sunlight. And that means that if you have more sunlight, there is less competition for you to grow. But obviously now, if we're all fighting for sunlight, there's still going to be competition. But at least I can grow upwards and sideways. And I have roots, which means that I can actually absorb more nutrients and better in foster environments. All right, so here's a little something. The pteridophytes have a sporophyte generation produced by haploid spores that develop in the gametophyte. And this gametophyte generation is called the prothallus. I'll show you a picture of that now in a bit. And the gametophyte generation, or the prothallus, produces gametes which depend on water for fertilization. So now you're noticing again that both pteridophytes as well as mosses or bryophytes rely or depend quite heavily on water for fertilization. And that's because there's no way of getting those spores across, or those gametes across, and actually finding a suitable mate. So to a large extent, it's dependent on water. Then the diploid zygote, once fertilization has occurred, grows by mitosis into the sporophyte generation. Now please note that in pteridophytes, the sporophyte generation is the adult plant. So its dominant phase or generation is the sporophyte, whereas in mosses, its dominant generation is the gametophyte generation. Okay, so there's a slight difference between the two. Now, just so that you guys have a basic understanding, and you guys can recognize that I've turned a entire piece of fern sideways. So we'll talk about all the other words around it, but I want to really draw your attention to the bottom where it says sorry position. So on the underside of every single one of these leaves is a little structure called a sori. One sorus. One sorus, many sori. Okay, so it sounds like sorry, I know, deal with it. Those round little yellow or orange structures over there are now like magnified one step up. You can see that it's called there the sorus, and that sorus is the whole round structure. If you take a portion of that sorus and you like zoom in even further, you'll find that it also has a sporangium. So again, it sounds very similar to fungus, where the sorus has these little balls, and in these balls is a sporangium, and that's where the spores actually develop. And then inside of the sporangium is where the spores are found. So when these spores start developing, the sporangium develops, the sorus develops. On the underside of the leaf structure, we'll get to why it's not necessarily a leaf just in a bit. They grow and develop, and eventually when they are ripe and ready, they can release. And this is generally after some heavy rains, so that they're ensuring that the idea of the fact that they're water dependent for fertilization can occur. This is a beautiful prothallus. I think this is one of the most beautiful things that I've ever encountered in my life, and this is a lovely version of it as well. So what you're noticing is that it's got this heart-shaped structure, and it's also known as the heart phase, funny enough, which is actually quite cute. So this heart phase particularly is known as a prothallus. So let me show you the male and female bits. So there's two big words on the screen now. The one is Archegonium and the other one is Antheridium. The Archegonium, anything ending in gonium sounds like, well, not really like gonads, but it's the female component of this prothallus. And then you got the Antheridium at the bottom over there, and what you can notice is there's two large masses on either side of the rhizoids, which are those sort of brownish things coming down the middle, and those are where the male gametes are being formed. So this is the Gametophyte generation, and the female gametophyte gametes are being produced in the Archegonium, and the male gametes are being produced in the Antheridium. So what you're also noticing is that when we did mosses, you recognize that they had two separate sexes. So they had a male gametophyte and then a separate female gametophyte. Whereas on ferns, they have a mixture of both male and female gametophytes all in one, okay? And there's big words that will come up later, but it's quite interesting how all that fertilization can take place directly on here. If we want to look at the alternation of generations of these plants, let's start at the left-hand side. So we've got the idea of a diploid plant. This is the what generation? The Sporophyte generation. So this Sporophyte generation is able to produce spores through the process of meiosis. Okay, so meiosis is when you take one parent cell and you split it into 4 genetically unidentical cells. Okay, and each one only has half the original set of the chromosomes. So these are haploid cells. These are able to land somewhere, preferably in dark and humid or damp environments, the moist environments, and then they're able to go through the process of mitosis. Each one of those cells will produce a gametophyte generation, or this prothallus, or this heart phase of the fern's life cycle. Once this is grown, you can imagine that there are many of these little heart phases all over the place, or many prothallus, and each one's going to release their gametophytes. So they're not releasing the female gametophytes, but they're releasing the male gametophytes, which often we find have little tails, so like a flagella at the back of it, which allows it to be motile and swim through the water. So once this happens, we will then find the fertilization has taken place from 2 separate prothallus, the sperm from one and the egg from the other, and then that will fuse, creating a new diploid plant, or the new Sporophyte generation. And you can recognize that you've never ever seen this heart phase before, which means it is not the dominant generation. The Sporophyte generation is the dominant generation. This is just another version of exactly the same thing. A couple of things I just want to point out to you over here is that they have got the Antheridium and they've got the Archegonium all on this entire thing. So if you look at the far right hand side, it has mature gametophyte, and on there at the bottom towards the rhizoids are the Antheridium, and further up towards the crevice of the heart, you'll find the Archegonium. Now please remember that the Antheridium, or the sperm, is really, really, really tiny, and as that they are very tiny, they're actually able to then reach the egg. And eventually we're going to be talking about microsporium and megasporium, and that just is related to the size of things. So micro meaning small, which are the sperm, and mega, which means large, which are the eggs. Fertilization occurs there where the Archegonium is, in one of those pockets, and then we can see just underneath over that it's a zygote, and that is 2N, which means it's now diploid. From where that fertilization had taken place, a brand new sporophyte will grow off of the gametophyte. So in order to almost make sure that the sporophyte generation continues, the gametophyte has already done a lot of the work. So it has now got a rhizome situation, which means it's absorbing a lot of water. So to a large extent, it's acting like its first leaf, if you will, for the sporophyte generation. This sporophyte then goes through a whole lot of mitosis, and eventually we can find a mature sporophyte or diploid over there. At the on one of the pieces over there, you can see they've taken a little square and they've like enlarged it on the side. So you can see that there are two sorus or two sori on either side of that leaf, and there are multiple running all the way down as well. In one of those like sori, you'll see a specific sporangium. Then the sporangium is enlarged. Inside of that sporangium, we're going to have spore formation through the process of meiosis, and then that is going to be released. That's going to land in its correct environment, and then it's going to start growing. So you can see the blue is haploid and the pinkish color is diploid. You do not have to learn this off by heart. Please, please do not learn this off by heart. This is more for you to be able to recognize what these actually look like. So we're going to start at the smallest, and then we're going to work our way out. All right. So if you have a look on the right hand side above where it says fiddlehead, it says pinule. So pinules is a sub-leaflet, and it's a division of the pinna. Now the pinna is the entire structure from what looks like the stem. So that entire piece across is a pinna. Now the pinna is attached to that middle piece over there, which is called the stalk or the stipe. Okay, so again, the pinule is on the pinna, and the pinna is attached to the stalk. Now this stalk changes in terms of what it actually is. So it has there at the right of the top above pinna, it has axis or rachis. You can say rachis if you want, but it's up to you. So this is where the stalk with the blade is attached to. Now what is the blade? The blade is a mixture of the pinna and pinules attached to the rachis. I'll say that again. The blade is a mixture of all three of those things, the axis, the pinna, and the pinules found on the pinna. So you can recognize that never once at any point over here have we mentioned the word leaf. And that's because these are still leaf-like structures, but we recognize that they do the same job as a leaf, so we're just going to call them leaves for now. On top of it, on the far left-hand side, we have the thing called the frond. So the frond is the entire structure from the base of the ground all the way to the tip of the fern. So when you go and pick a fern out of your garden and run up to your parent and say, I found a fern leaf, I am going to have heart failure. What it ultimately is you've picked up an entire frond. And you'll notice in the next section how the idea of a frond develops in the gymnosperms as well. Right underneath over that, we have something called a rhizome. And I really need you to like highlight this and write this down somewhere. A rhizome is the equivalent of an underground stem. So as much as the stalk and rachis look like a stem, it's actually just the extended part of the inside of the leaf, which is known actually as the veins of a leaf. Okay. So the rhizome is technically an underground stem, and then that's where we find our root. So if you have some ferns at home, I recommend you go and pull one out. You might find little ball-like structures attached to it as well. And if you remember when we did symbiotic relationships between bacteria and plants, there were some bacteria that were able to convert free nitrogen into nitrates and nitrites. And inside of those little balls that you're going to pull out of the ground, that is where you'll find that bacteria actually. Then on the side over there, one of my favorite words, it's called a fiddlehead. So a little baby frond is developing from a fiddlehead, and that is because, like, you know, on the violin itself there's a bit that curls at the end, and that's why we call it a fiddlehead. All right, so now to end Pteridophytes, I want you now to go on to activity 3, sorry, on page 254. And there is a activity on seedless plants, and those are bryophytes and pteridophytes. So please, 254, go and do that for me. Hope you're having a good day in your coping, ladies. Cheers.